Father God, we thank you for your word. Thank you for Sarah just explaining that for us and helping us to understand what your word says about how we deal and cope with the frustrations of life. Father, we pray that as we look at this passage now, help us really to plumb the depths of our own heart to understand the nature of this for us, that we would understand what we do with frustrations and injustice when we see it. Amen. Ecclesiastes 4, and I'm going to read the whole chapter here, which is everything you can see on the screen. Again, I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. And I declared that the dead who'd already died are happier than the living who are still alive. But better than both is the one who's never been born, who has not seen the evil that is done under the sun. And I saw that all the toil and achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil and chasing after the wind. Again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother, yet there was no end to his toil. Yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling? He asked. Why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born in poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. There was no end to all the people who were before them. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I'll put that up again in a second. But before I do, I just wanted to really start with just a reminder of what Ecclesiastes is all about. It's a fascinating book that works hard to say, if you start from the framework of just what we see in this world, with no real belief in God, what is the alternative position to the Christian position? What is the point to life? Where does that lead us? Does it work? And so he writes about this position, what he calls under the sun thinking, to say, what are we meant to make of life? And he starts with that conclusion that we saw before. Life is a vapor. It's meaningless. Everything is meaningless. It promises so much. It promises lasting meaning, but it never quite delivers because of those 3 things that Sarah mentioned: chaos, injustice, and death. And in this passage, you can see from verse 1, he's starting from this position of looking at the problem of injustice. That's the big focus of this passage. And really saying the reason that life never really delivers on the promise of life is our inability really to love one another, look after each other, and what's the solution to that? And so we're going to see 2 things really, and I've put them in the 2 halves of this passage. Let me put this up again so you can have it in front of you as we look at it. The 2 halves that we're going to look at are the 2 halves that I've split it into the 2 halves. So there on the left-hand side, you can see that the downside, the hate your neighbor and what's the root of injustice. And then on the other side, on the right-hand side, you can begin to see love your neighbor and the path to safety. So on this side, on the left-hand side, where we begin, what do we see? The root of injustice. Verse 1 begins with the real discouragement of oppression that is taking place under the sun. And he's looking at the oppressed, and he's seeing how power is on the side of the oppressors. And he's seeing the use of power, the people who oppress and exploit. He sees the political bullies, the people with wealth and influence and status. And there is another side, these people who are oppressed with no one to stand up for them. And he sees the problem, even though it doesn't direct him, even though it doesn't affect him directly, he says, I saw the tears of the oppressed. He's looking at other people who are oppressed. I think for many of us, I mean, it's a striking thing even just to see. For many of us, we only really get angry with injustice when we experience it for ourselves firsthand. We fly off the handle at God when something really wrong happens to us and hurts us. But it was never a problem for us until that point. At least the teacher is able to see what is going on in the world and grapple with injustice, even as he sees it and observes it. And the thing that bothers him, so much so that he repeats it twice, is they have no comforter. They have no comforter. There is no one who will stand up and do the right thing. That's from the perspective of life under the sun. There isn't justice. There are not enough people who stand up for justice. There isn't a rescuer who can offer justice to the oppressed. And I think what he's doing is saying, if you look in the here and now and believe there's no consequences for our actions beyond this life, what you will see is people time and time again exploiting others. Why? Because there's something deeply flawed in our human nature. And then he takes this line in verses 2 and 3, which begins to get very, very bleak indeed. Those who have died are happier than those who are still alive. That's maybe not a surprise if you believe in the hope of heaven. But verse 3 is really deep, dark conclusion. Happy are those who've never been born because they don't get to see the evil done under the sun. Now, I think, again, we've got to remember what he's doing, his deliberate kind of rhetoric working on according to his under the sun thinking. It's a shocking thing to say. But it's really shocking because he writes as someone, he doesn't hide the fact he's a man of great wealth and influence. He identifies with Solomon or someone in Solomon's school, but even he, a man of unparalleled wealth and power, is powerless to sort out the problem of injustice and sort out the problem of evil. And what he wants to do is take us to the core of the issue, and this we find really here in verse 4. The core problem is envy. That you and I, we have a drive within us. We want to leave this life with something to show for ourselves. But here's the thing, I have to leave with just a little bit more than you. And you have to leave this life with a little bit more than me. My friend jokingly says, he lives down the street from me. He says this as a joke, but it's quite a pithy little joke. He says, he with the most stuff at the end wins. And you think about that board game, the game of life, which some people, I think, believe was some kind of capitalist conspiracy to indoctrinate kids in the 1980s. You know, the aim of the game is to accumulate the most stuff. But that is actually what lots of us do. We need far more in our lives than just basic provisions. We need to win. Life isn't a place where we serve, it's a thing to win. And what he's saying is deeply profound, because he's saying when we see the injustice in society, it is a bigger problem than we think. We sometimes kid ourselves and think, you know, all we need is the right political system or the right technology or a redistribution of wealth, or whatever it is. And he's saying, no, the problem is more fundamental. It's a problem of the human condition. I look at the people around me and what do I see? I see rivals. And you might think to yourself, well, I don't, okay? I don't get what you're going on. That's not me. You're not describing me. Really? Really? Don't you find yourself comparing yourself to others? That's envy. Don't you ever have a little look on Facebook, if you're on Facebook, and see what your old school friends are doing? How do you cope when you discover that your friends are more successful than you are? Or that they have children? Or they have better looking children? One of my school friends became a judge on The Voice. You know, when you see those, if you get a little pang of jealousy, you know, that's envy. Or if you see that they're doing worse than you see that they're suffering through a relationship breakdown. If you take comfort in that, a little glow of smugness, what's that? It's envy. Because it's the drive in you that says, I need to win. I just need for my life to be better than other people's lives around me. And so the writer of Ecclesiastes calls it out. Now, he mentions a couple of things here. He says, the first thing is kind of surprising. Verse 5 is not the verse you would expect to follow follow on from that. But he says that, listen, there are a couple of responses to this. First of all, you have this response of what you might think the teacher is advising, but he calls out laziness. He says, no, it's the fool who crosses his arms and says, I'm not going to play by everybody else's rules. I'm not going to compete. Aren't I holy? I've managed to escape the rat race. But he says, don't do that. They ruin themselves. Excuse me. Oh, sneezing into a camera is even worse than doing it live. Sorry. We really are live streaming. There you go. It's real proof. So he says, listen, don't live by the rules of everybody else, and don't just withdraw and say, well, I'm just not going to compete. I'm not going to do anything. He says, no. If you stop striving, then you don't achieve anything. You can't support yourself. And that's not what we were made for. Which is why he seems to settle in verse 6 here, this better one handful. It's a thing of basically a plea for moderation. And that results in his wisdom. That's all he really concludes. Try and be content with what you have. Because then what he contrasts it with, he goes back to the man who thinks they need everything with this illustration here of a man who's trying to get to have 2 handfuls of everything. And he has this description of a man who is driven by his need to succeed, to gain wealth. But the price he pays for it is relationship. So he has this description in verse 8 of this man all alone, neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, and yet the harshness of the whole thing is he was not content with his wealth. It's like an addiction. It's like no matter how much he gets, he's never satisfied until one day, like Scrooge, I guess, he hits the buffers, has this moment of realization, and asks this question: for whom am I toiling? For whom am I toiling? Now, that's a very profound question, because what the writer of Ecclesiastes is forcing you to confront is this sense we have, according to the world under the sun, that the material world is all there is. The universe is all about matter. And that means life really is about the accumulation of stuff. It's about getting what you can out of life. It's about winning. It's about accumulating what you can and putting it under your power. And the problem is with that is as you strive for it, you actually become less human. You start looking at people as though they're commodities. You rank their worth by their economic output or how they can benefit you in some way. What's that? It's the problem of envy. It leads to oppression. And what the teacher wants to expose is that the fundamental currency of the universe isn't stuff, it's relationships. That's the above the sun thinking here. That's what he's saying here. You need people more than you need stuff. When you go to a party over Zoom at the moment, and someone says to you, "Who are you?" What do you say? Well, you don't say, "Hi, I'm Martin. I have an Aston Martin. I have a 4,000 foot square home. I've got golf clubs with my names inscribed on them." And if you do, if that's genuinely, sometimes you meet someone who might answer like that. What do? You immediately rule them out and say, well, you are a deeply superficial person. You're probably fairly unlikable. When you go to a party over Zoom and someone says, "Who are you?" You say, "I'm Martin. I'm married to Angela. I have, we have 2 grandchildren," and so on. And so you define yourself by your relationships. Why? Because the currency of the universe is relational. Why? Because God is relational. 3 in 1, Father, Son, and Spirit. So it's foolishness to make stuff the fundamental sign that you're worthy in life, because what you really crave most is relationships, deep relationships. Look at Christ for a minute. Was he the poorest man who ever lived because he owned nothing? Or was he the richest man who ever lived because of the intimacy of his relationship with the Father? You have to decide, rich or poor. How are you going to measure it? And I want to say this on this question of what do we do? They have no comforter. where is the hope in the midst of that? It's actually only as Christ comes along at the start of Luke's gospel. The first thing actually in Luke's gospel we see Jesus do, he goes to the synagogue to announce the start of his public ministry, and he reads a quote from Isaiah. This is what he reads: "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and the recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." And then do you know what he does? He rolls up the scroll, he sits down, and he says, "Today that promise has been fulfilled in me." Now, do you see the agony, the cry that Ecclesiastes sets up for us? And here is Christ, who brings hope of liberation and oppression. And the surprise, the shock for us as we look at Christ, is that the liberation he offers isn't political. He doesn't come to start a revolution, but to announce that God sees and God knows, and one day he will put everything right. And his ministry and our ministry now, in some ways, is still the beginnings of that, to put things right, to live with truth and justice at the center of life. Christ comes to set people free, not just from their oppressors, though, actually, but from their addiction to envy. It's a much deeper solution. So I want to say, as we come to the end of part one, don't miss the opportunity that this pandemic gives you to do some of that heart work. I think in some ways the pandemic can act as a bit of a reset. If you've been stuck in patterns and behaviors about what you want, about what you dream about, or about what you live for, about the rhythms of life, of kind of looking forward to the holiday, or looking forward to the next career jump, or whatever it is about how you work. Maybe you're struggling to know how to make sense of the pandemic, what to do in the midst of all this. Well, don't miss the opportunity. Let God discipline you about those things. Don't let yourself go back to a normal of the past. Instead, maybe God is saying to you, you've been living for the wrong things. It's time to put some things right. You've been living with this addiction for more, and I've taken some stuff away from you, and now you see it. Don't miss the opportunity of this pandemic. But secondly, this really leads us into, not very nicely, into the second half of this passage, and thinking about some of the implications about how we learn not just to not hate our neighbor, but how we learn to love our neighbor and the route to safety. And so from verse 9 to 16 here, he sets out a different way of living. And he says we need to develop a depth of relationships and learn to live in a society and in families where everybody is not out for themselves, to really solve the problem of envy. Now, I do want to say, Kate, at the middle of this, you have this little thing in verse 12, a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. And that has become really popular. I don't know if you noticed, for people to read that at weddings, kind of, and it sounds really nice. I want to make clear, I don't think this passage is at all about marriage. Or I don't think it's not at all about marriage, but I don't think it's primarily about marriage. It's about having the kinds of relationships where you collaborate together for the common good. To work alone, to strive alone, is futile. That's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is putting his finger on. He's saying individualism does not work. The idea that we should strive for ourselves does not work. And so he uses here these little illustrations. He's got he starts with this thing that 2 are better than 1, and then he explains about why that is. And you've got to think of someone traveling through a Middle Eastern country at night 2,500 years ago. Okay, what are the risks that you face? Well, first of all, you're at high risk of falling into a pit. The area around Jerusalem had lots of pits. You might be thinking, really, that's quite strange. They had a pothole issue back in Jerusalem. They did. They had loads of pits at the roadside to catch animals, to store bitumen, all sorts. And it was dangerous. So he says, listen, people don't walk around on their own. Why? Because they might fall over. He also says, actually, we need one another when we're traveling. We kind of club together for the sake of warmth. People didn't typically have small tents that they would travel around. And if you were poor and traveling between towns, you'd just find other travelers, and you'd sleep almost on top of them to share warmth, share your cloaks. And that's part of what you did. And thirdly, you have the risk of bandits, people coming together. So again, as people walked on the roads, they would kind of find other people to walk with and travel together in groups for mutual protection. And the teacher is saying, listen, that's the way. Look at that and learn something. That is the way to avoid injustice. Collaborate together, work together to fight off all your enemies. It's the principle of society and a community of mutual protection. I always find it fascinating that when God invites us to become Christians, what we're being invited to is more than just a relationship with God. I find it frustrating when we only talk in those terms about becoming a Christian. Because you think to yourself, well, if God is enough, well, surely I'm just in a relationship with him. And it's not. We're invited into something bigger than that. We need other people. But why is it? Why does Jesus not just call us to him, but also call us to be part of church? Why can't I just work out everything on my own? Why isn't everything just between me and God? God has designed things so that we're not enough on our own. Think about Adam. It's not good for him to be on his own. We need relationships. We need one another. We need church. We can't cope on our own. No man is an island, and no Christian is a church. I think one of the strange things about this pandemic that we're living through is the way it's really attacked and defeated, in some ways, individualism. Particularly that message, we need to protect the NHS, and there's a little part of that makes, I want to do that because, it's a little bit selfish because I think I don't want a system to be overwhelmed because I might need that system. But we realize, no, this works best if we all play our part and do something responsibly. But that might mean I have to give up some of my rights. I need to stop thinking all the time, what's in it for me? One of my friends pointed out to me a few weeks ago, if you posted on Facebook in January, from now on, I'm going to start living for myself. I'm going to pursue my dreams, whatever the cost. I'm not living by anybody else's rules. I want to live life to the full and see the world. In January, if you posted that, nobody would batter an eyelid at that. In fact, you'd be affirmed for that. You post that now, I'm going to live for myself. I'm going to travel. I don't care what anybody else says, or I'm not going to live by anyone else's rules. That's the opposite of stay home, protect the NHS, save lives. The only way we get through this is by choosing to sacrifice our desires for the sake of others. And that's right. The thing we need to remember in the midst of a pandemic is that's not just right for a season. That's how life always works. And so the teacher gives us this proverb in verse 12 at the conclusion: a cord of three strands is not quickly or easily broken. That threefold cord is other people in our lives. We need quality of relationships. We need people who will support us, who will lift us up through hard times. We need real and deep community because there are times we need to be carried. There are times where we can't rely on ourselves. So I want to say marriage is not that threefold cord, or not uniquely that threefold cord. God is not uniquely that threefold cord. The people of God, I think, are that threefold cord. Now let me push us and say, well, how does that play out in our lives? Well, I think one of the things I want to say is it means that we've got to rely on each other financially to some degree. You might find that you have plenty of money at the moment. If you do, would you consider giving some money to the Grace Church Love Fund specifically? It's a fund that's been set up to provide support payments for people in short-term financial difficulty in the church. And a small number of families have been receiving financial gifts from Grace Church regularly. I think we're giving away around £3,500 since the start of March to families with financial need. And we may need to support more families and support families for a longer period of time. But we need your help to do that. If you want to give, you can give specifically to support that love fund. I think that's an application of verse 9. But secondly, can I encourage you to keep meeting with friends, with prayer triplets, keep meeting together with community group over Zoom. I think some of us, you might feel like this. If you spend 4 or 5 hours on Zoom on a day, and you're suffering by this sort of Zoom fatigue, by the end of the day. The last thing you want in the evening is to, again, open up your computer, start again for community group or a prayer triplet. But you need to remind yourself, I need this, we need this, other people need this. Maybe you will be the first person that evening that other people have got to speak to that day. And they need you there, pointing them to Jesus. It's not just what can I get out of this, it's also what do I need to offer other people? We need the help of other people to make it through this. It would be so sad if the pandemic actually critiqued the myth of individualism, but encouraged a permanent social isolation. As if we learn to actually, in the end, live just far more isolated from each other. I think we need to actively fight that and be more connected with one another through this. And for some of us, that's really hard. We're easily hurt. We look forward to a life without friendships or relationships, at least. You know, we think to ourselves, I'd like to live on a farm and not see people anymore. And we need to remind ourselves from the writer of Ecclesiastes, we were made for relationship. Think of how Christ does relationships. The cost of relationships in this world under the sun is it involves sacrifice. Christ gave up his life for his friends. And that's strange for us. And, you know, it's possible now, in a way, in this age, to choose your friends to such a degree that you live permanently with people who just agree with you. You get more cross with the people who disagree with us than we ever have done. And we don't like being around people who challenge us. Part of the role of being a church is to bring people together who are not alike and enable us to influence one another. We have a role in shaping each other, even though we're not the same. I've been reading a book about the digital age at the moment. It said, the writer says this, maybe there is a key function of church attendance in this digital age. We must withdraw from our online world together as a body in our local churches. We gather to be seen, to feel awkward, and perhaps feel a little unheard and underappreciated, all on purpose. And then he finishes by explaining how actually it's only as we begin to see relationships not merely there all the time to serve us, but in order to serve others that we begin to make sense of this. Well, then you'll see there's a last little section here that I've not really referenced. I'm going to do this very, very quickly because the writer of Ecclesiastes finishes the chapter with a very strange story that illustrates something that you don't expect it to illustrate. I think there's two things here. The first is kind of reinforcing his point. You need other people in your life. But secondly, you need to do it without living for the praise of other people in your life. And so he has this strange story, better a poor but wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to heed a warning. And so he starts with this old king. We're supposed to kind of imagine a king who should be wise, he's lived enough of life to be wise, but he's given into this temptation to live alone. He doesn't trust people. He accumulates wealth for himself. And along comes his rival, this poor but wise youth. We read about him. The youth may have come from prison to the kingship, or he may have been born into poverty within his kingdom. I saw that all who lived and walked under the sun followed the youth, the king's successor. Well, there we go. So this youth who isn't rich, but he is wise, he learns how to influence people. He doesn't live in social isolation. And for that reason, he rises to become the king. And you think of someone like Joseph here, you know, years in prison in Egypt to rise to become the political leader. Now, if the story stopped there at the end of verse 15, you'd think, okay, nice. We're finishing the chapter with a nice reassuring story that illustrates the point that's gone along all the way. But it's not that. The youth is also an illustration too. He says, but there was no end to all the people who were before them. But those who came later were not pleased with the successor. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What he's saying is the youth is a warning too. Living in relationships with other people is not the same as living in praise of other people. That actually is just as dangerous. Why? Because the ones who came later were not pleased with the successor either. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. And what he's saying is, he's making this contrast to say, listen, don't go it alone in life like the old foolish king. Don't do that. But at the same time, don't play to the crowd, which is what this young guy has been doing. He's been, he's young, he's on social media, he's an influencer, whatever it is, however you like to portray it. Again, for us, the antidote to this, Jesus is our model. He kept people close to him. He worked with 12 disciples. He was particularly close to 3 of them, but he never played the crowd. Why? Because the crowd is fickle. The crowd chants one week, Hosanna, Hosanna to the King of Kings, and the next week it chants, crucify him, crucify him. So find people you love, find people who you trust, let them in, give them permission to critique you, let them help you. That is a wise thing. And never expect everyone to love you. Fame is not the same as friendship. Being loved by a crowd who don't really know you is not the same as being loved by someone who does. And so he finishes with this sense of vapor at the end of it all. What are we supposed to make of it all? What do we get for all the under the sun thinking? Well, not a whole lot. Without the New Testament hope of a new heavens and a new earth shared with people from every age, language, ethnicity, it's hard to see the point of relationships, but we see it. Why? Because Christ comes. He is the one who brings comfort to his people. He is the one who is trustworthy and dependable. He is the one who forms in people a desire and a commitment to live with and for